I ended my last lecture with this iconic painting. I hope you had a chance to watch some of the excellent video discussing this work. Let me make just a few additional points. The tricorn hat circled in green was a symbol of the French Revolution. Also, Delacroix signed the painting on the barricades. I've circled the signature in red, drawing attention to this, again, iconic element of the Revolution. In the 1850s, after another revolution in 1848, the French political leadership enlisted the architect Haussmann to remake Paris into a city of wide, tree-lined avenues that we enjoy today. The alleged goal was to make the city more sanitary. The unspoken, but probably more important goal, was to make it harder for the riffraff to throw up barricades. Note that Delacroix rendered the allegorical figure of victory quite unallegorically. Art critics at the time weren't especially dismayed by her bare breasts. There's nothing new in that in a large French painting. But they were dismayed by the dirt on her dress and by the way she thrust herself into the middle of the battle rather than hovering decorously in the air. The newly installed bourgeois king, Louis Philippe, bought the painting and hung it in the palace gallery. But after the Parisian mob staged another rebellion in 1832, more barricades, the king had the painting taken down and returned it to Delacroix. When the Revolution of 1848 brought in another republic, Liberty Leading the People came out of storage and was actually displayed at the Academy Salon of 1855. In 1874, the painting entered the collection of the Louvre in Paris, where it is now one of France's most cherished images. I'm going to flip through just a few more works by Delacroix, both to prepare you for a possible attribution question and to illustrate some further elements of Romanticism. I'm working down that slide. The story depicted here comes from a poem by the great Romantic poet Lord Byron, and the setting is the ever-popular exotic Near East. Here, an Assyrian king has learned that his armies have been defeated, so he has his guards kill off his women, slaves, and horses. More Orientalism with the usual dose of sex and violence to keep our interest. And here we see the fascination with Orientalism combined with headline news. In 1822, the inhabitants of the Greek island of Chios tried to join the Greek War of Independence. Ottoman Turks invaded the island and killed or enslaved tens of thousands of islanders. This war fascinated and horrified classically educated Western European elites who felt a strong tie to ancient Greece. The Romantic poet Byron died fighting for Greece. Here's still another element of Romanticism, which we saw in the Raft of the Medusa. Romantic painters often chose current events and what they saw as ongoing injustices as the subject of their works. And here are some paintings that Delacroix made in a visit to North Africa in 1832. Note that the dangerous power of nature is another romantic theme. Tigers, beautiful and deadly, are perfect examples of the sublime. Okay, German Romanticism has fallen off the list, but I can't ignore this famous painting altogether. Germany was the epicenter of a particularly gloomy and dramatic form of Romanticism, represented above all by the great poet and dramatist Goethe. His work inspired a cult of the solitary, sorrowful, romantic young man seeking the meaning of life in an often unforgiving nature, and here he is. Look closely and you will see a shipwreck, once again highlighting the eternal struggle between man and nature. I love the rhythm of this painting, with its strong parallel diagonals and, of course, its pyramidal composition. The English Romantics were just as enamored of nature and just as eager to get in touch with their feelings, but they were far too British to engage in a lot of Germanic angst. You'd never guess it from this painting, but what we're seeing is a response to another great set of 19th century revolutions, usually lumped together under the term the Industrial Revolution. Artists such as Constable were mostly dismayed by industrialization's impact on the countryside, displaced agricultural workers, and increasing pollution. Here he seeks to recapture the rural simplicity of his rural Suffolk childhood. Okay, enough recapping and detouring. Here is our next required work. You just looked at a British landscape painting. What is different about the Oxbow, which is probably the most famous painting of the so-called Hudson River School? And for that matter, what might be different about American Romanticism? think the quote on the slide offers a clue. While Cole is also addressing the sublime and even uses the term sublime in his American context, in his statement here, in the American context it refers more to nature's beauties than to its terrors. Note the word birthright. Art historians sometimes associate Cole with the notion of manifest destiny, that God had given the land to the Americans to settle. Cole painted this work partly in response to a British art critic who claimed that Americans did not pay enough attention to their own scenery. In case you're feeling sleepy and neglecting your workbooks, I should mention that your long essay for Unit 10 will focus on political messages that are conveyed through romantic landscapes. Note that Cole reveals mixed feelings about settlement. He quite deliberately contrasts the raw beauty of nature on the left with the still lovely but less dramatic settled land on the right. Is this a tribute to the way Americans have tamed nature and made it fruitful, or do we detect a note of regret? Where, after all, has this artist chosen to hang out himself? That's his self-portrait that I've circled in red. And we see from this close-up he's chosen to hang out in the wilderness, not in the settled terrain. Note the brush strokes. We're seeing more of those loose daubs of bright color characteristic of much romantic painting. Cole also illustrated James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, which mourned the passing of the noble savage, again one of Rousseau's favorite themes. This too suggests at least a little ambiguity about progress. Some art historians think that Cole left a hidden message in the oxbow. The word Noah is roughly incised in Hebrew letters. A code that read upside down spells out Shaddai, the Almighty. So the landscape isn't just an American birthright, it is a beautiful element of God's creation. Romantic painters were in general more sympathetic to religion, but this was especially true in the United States, where the rebellion against religion was not as major an element of the Enlightenment. Since we live in the West, I have to throw in another famous American landscape painter who is sometimes associated with the Hudson River School, even though he mostly painted California's Sierra Nevada mountains, and not always all that realistically, I would add. But this too is nature sublime, but not as terrifying. And here's another Bierstadt painting, this time with human figures portrayed as noble pioneers fulfilling the call to settle America from sea to sea. More manifest destiny, a point that has shown up on past AP exams. But in fairness, Bierstadt also regretted the loss of wilderness as settlement marched westward. This Mexican artist painted 50 years after the oxbow, but I think you'll see some important similarities. What are they? Well, there are a lot of compositional similarities. We see a bird's eye view, the contrast between wilderness and civilization, the hillside in the foreground, the thunderstorm receding in the distance, and the tiny figures captured in the wild portion of the painting. Moreover, this is also a nationalist work, asserting a Mexican vision of nature and of history. Velasco actually understood what he was looking at probably better than Cole did. Before entering the Academy of San Carlos, which was the first art academy and the first art museum in the Americas, he studied zoology and botany at the nearby medical school. I know I'm repeating the Khan Academy video you watched, or that I hope you watched, but in the distance we see important historical landmarks. Circled in red is the Basilica of Guadalupe, next to the hill of Tepeyac, where the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared to Juan Diego. The roads marked out in purple are the ancient Aztec causeways and now Mexican roads leading into Mexico City. The ancient Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was built on Lake Texcoco, circled in green and already receding under the pressure of agricultural and industrial development. Today it has almost entirely disappeared. Here we see the ancient volcanoes that, according to Aztec legend, represented two ill-fated lovers, an Aztec princess and a courageous warrior. The Khan Academy experts pronounce these names. I'm not as brave. The similarities between the two paintings are probably not accidental. Velasco would have known American landscape painting, and like Cole, he was making a patriotic point about his nation's beautiful landscape and dramatic history. On to our final Romanticism.